In May 1940, when the German blitzkrieg swept across the Ardennes, France's defenses collapsed faster than anyone believed possible. The French army fought bravely, but the Luftwaffe owned the air. By the time Paris fell, the tricolor flag still waved on a few battered aircraft wings, symbols of a country defeated, but not destroyed. The French Air Force, once proud, once modern, was in ruins. Its bases were bombed, its squadrons scattered, its pilots hunted, and yet some refused to land. During those desperate weeks in June 1940, French pilots took off from airfields already under artillery fire. They flew outdated machines, Morane-Saulnier 406 seconds, WWII 520 seconds, Bloch MB 152 seconds, against German Messerschmitts that outnumbered and outperformed them. Many were shot down before they even saw the enemy, but others men, like René Mouchot, Roland de la Poype, and Jacques André, kept flying until the very end. Mouchot later wrote in his diary, "We no longer fight for victory, we fight for honor." When France signed the armistice on the 22nd of June 1940, the war seemed over for them. But for a handful of pilots, it was only the beginning. As German forces occupied France, a small number of airmen refused to surrender their aircraft. They flew south, then west, crossing the Mediterranean to North Africa or northward, across the Channel, to Britain. Some didn't even have enough fuel to make it. One WWII fighter crashed into the sea off Plymouth, its pilot rescued by fishermen who had never heard a French accent that defiant. When asked why he had risked his life, he replied simply, "Because someone must continue to fight." Those words would become the creed of a new kind of Frenchman, one who fought not for the government that had surrendered, but for the idea of France that could not die. In July 1940, London was a city bracing for war. The German Luftwaffe had begun bombing raids on British ports and airfields. Britain stood alone, its army battered, its skies under siege, but it was not truly alone. Across the city, in small boarding houses and converted offices, men from all over Europe were gathering Poles, Czechs, Norwegians, Belgians, and among them, a few hundred French. They were soldiers without a country, pilots without a base, and patriots without a flag. Then came the voice that gave them purpose, Charles de Gaulle, broadcasting from London on the 18th of June, 1940. "France has lost a battle, but France has not lost the war." Those words echoed through the static of the BBC and into the hearts of every Frenchman still willing to fight. Among them were pilots who would soon become legends. By late 1940, the Forces Aériennes Françaises Libres, the Free French Air Forces, began forming under British command. At first, they were small, barely a few dozen aircraft, but their spirit was enormous. They wore British uniforms with French insignia. They flew British planes with French hearts. The first units were attached to the Royal Air Force under the Lend-Lease structure, forming distinct French squadrons known by RAF designations. No Mark 340 Squadron Ile-de-France, no. 341 Squadron Alsace, no. 342 Squadron Lorraine, and others that would follow across the Mediterranean. They fought alongside British Spitfires and Hurricanes, defending the same skies that had saved Britain from invasion. The irony was powerful. France, defeated on the ground, was reborn in the air. René Mouchot was among the first. Born in Paris, he had trained as a pilot before the war and fled to Britain after refusing to serve under Vichy. He joined the RAF's No. 65 Squadron, then helped form No. 340 Ile-de-France. In his journal, he wrote of the first time he saw a Spitfire. It looked like freedom itself. His early missions were simple: escort convoys, patrol the Channel, engage enemy bombers. But every flight was also a message. To the world, France still flew. His comrades, like Jacques-Henri Schlossing, Bernard Duperrier, and Philippe de Citivaux, shared the same fire. Each sortie carried not only bullets, but pride. The Luftwaffe called them the ghosts of France. They carried the Cross of Lorraine on their fuselages, de Gaulle's symbol of resistance, and they fought with a ferocity that belied their small numbers. Dogfights over the English Channel became their baptism by fire. In tight spirals of vapor and gunfire, they dueled with German Messerschmitts at altitudes where the world below seemed irrelevant. Mouchot described one such encounter. The sky was white with contrails. I could see the channel glinting below, and the enemy ahead, sharp, bright, relentless. I dived. I fired. I missed. He turned. I turned. For a moment I forgot the earth existed. These battles were not about territory. They were about existence itself, proof that France was still alive. By 1941, the Free French squadrons had grown. They attracted volunteers from colonies, exiles, and even escaped prisoners of war. Their accents came from Casablanca, Algiers, Dakar, and Marseille. But in the cockpit, they spoke only one language: flight. The British pilots respected them deeply, though sometimes with amusement. The French drank wine instead of tea. They sang before missions. They painted pin-up girls and mottos like Liberté toujours on their aircraft. But when the scramble bell rang, all differences vanished. One RAF commander said, "They flew like artists, fought like lions, and died like gentlemen." Freedom had a price. By mid-1942, the casualty rate among the Free French pilots was staggering. Nearly half of those who had joined in 1940 were dead or missing. Their losses mirrored the RAF's, but their grief was deeper, because every man lost meant another fragment of France gone forever. Still, they refused to stop. When Mouchot's Spitfire was shot down over the English Channel in August 1943, his diary was found in the wreckage. The final entry read, "If I fall, let my mother know that I died believing in France." He was 29 years old. De Gaulle personally honored him posthumously, calling him the soul of the Free French in the air. Meanwhile, another squadron was carving its place in history. Groupe de Chasse II, 7 Alsace. Formed in 1941, it carried the name of a province torn from France by Germany in 1871, and its pilots vowed to reclaim it in spirit long before it was liberated on the ground. Alsace fought first in North Africa, flying Curtiss P-42s and later Spitfires in the scorching skies over Libya and Tunisia. They strafed German convoys, bombed Axis supply lines, and dueled with the best of the Luftwaffe's desert aces. They wore scarves under their flight suits to keep the sand out of their throats, and painted storks, the emblem of Alsace, on their planes. By 1943, they were veterans. By 1944, they were legends. The story of the Free French pilots was not just one of battles won, but of identity reclaimed. When France fell, its government surrendered, but its sky refused. From London to Algiers, from the Channel to the Sahara, men who had once been labeled refugees became the vanguard of France's rebirth. They proved that courage could survive defeat and that freedom could take flight even from ruins. As the war raged on, they would go on to fight in Italy, the liberation of France, and the final push into Germany. But their spirit, the refusal to surrender even when the homeland lay in ashes, was born here, in those early years, above the English Channel. They were the forgotten eagles of France. And they were just beginning to soar. When a Free French pilot arrived at an RAF base, he was usually exhausted, underfed, and carrying little more than a photograph from home. Most had crossed half the world by fishing boat from Brittany, through Spain's prisons, or across the Sahara in convoys that ran out of fuel before they found the coast. Yet the moment they stepped onto British soil, they stood straighter. They were soldiers again. The British called it the circus, the endless cycle of briefings, scrambles, and debriefs that defined fighter life in 1941. At Tangmere, Biggin Hill, and Northolt, the new French arrivals met squadrons already forged in the Battle of Britain. The Spitfires gleamed silver in the morning fog. The air smelled of oil, damp grass, and tea. To the French, everything felt both alien and familiar. The discipline was strict, the humor dry, the breakfast terrible. But the sky, the sky was the same color as home. Captain Bernard Duperrier remembered his first day with the RAF. The English taught us that punctuality is a weapon. They had no patience for drama, only for precision. He learned to navigate by cloud shape, to trust instruments rather than instinct, and to wait for the order, scramble. The single word that turned exhaustion into adrenaline. Communication was chaos at first. Left and right became port and starboard. 9 o'clock high replaced a gauche. During early missions, misunderstandings nearly cost lives. So the French invented their own code, half English, half Gallic slang, an airborne dialect that only they understood. British controllers nicknamed it franglais at 20,000 feet. But in combat, meaning was clear enough. Tracer fire, vapor trails, and the roar of Merlin engines spoke the same language. When the guns cooled and the engines ticked silent, life on base took on its strange rhythm. They played cards in mess halls hung with rationed curtains, scribbled letters they might never post, and argued about music. Someone always had a bottle of cognac hidden behind the navigation charts. At night, blackouts turned the countryside into a sea of stars. From the windows of their huts, pilots could see searchlights probing the sky like slow-moving swords. One wrote home, "The English drink tea when bombs fall. We open wine. In this at least, we remain French." RAF officers admired their courage, but sometimes doubted their discipline. French pilots, they said, had too much style, too much emotion. Yet those same qualities made them unforgettable wingmen. Squadron leader Douglas Bader once remarked, "They fought like poets, reckless and magnificent." It was true. The French turned dogfights into art, rolling Spitfires through impossible dives, firing at point-blank range, laughing afterward as if cheating death were a sport. In 1941, the RAF officially formed No. 340 Squadron, Île-de-France. Its badge bore the Cross of Lorraine. Its motto read, "A terrible beauty is born." Within weeks, they were flying coastal patrols, then offensive sweeps over the occupied coast. Their mission was both tactical and symbolic, to show occupied France that her sons still fought. Each time they crossed the channel, someone whispered the same phrase over the radio. "Bonjour, la France. Nous revenons." Good morning, France. We're coming back. While Île-de-France defended Britain's skies, another group prepared for a different front. In Syria, under General Catrou, a nucleus of pilots gathered from the colonies, Moroccans, Tunisians, and Europeans from North Africa. They would become GC-2-7 Alsace. Their commander, Commandant Georges Delfino, was a veteran of 1940 who had escaped through Gibraltar. He told his men, "We fly for the province that Germany stole. Every bullet we fire carries the name of Alsace." Their training base at Rayak, baked under the Levant sun. Mechanics worked shirtless among palm trees. The planes, American-built P-40 Tomahawks, gleamed like bronze animals. Dust filled everything. Engines coughed sand. But spirits were high. In 1942, Alsace was attached to the British 8th Army in North Africa. Their job, low-level ground attack against Rommel's supply lines. They flew so low that bullets sometimes hit their propellers. From the air, the Sahara looked endless yellow dunes marked by black trails of smoke. Each mission began before dawn, the sun rising red behind them like a burning world. A British observer described the sight. They appeared from the horizon like hawks, engines howling, wings skimming the sand. It was war stripped of glamour, no duels in the clouds, only heat, thirst, and the endless roar of cannon fire. War took its toll quickly. Lieutenant Guy de Boisgau fell near Tobruk, shot down while attacking a convoy. His wingman circled the crash site until fuel ran out, then flew home in silence. In his tent that night, Commandant Delfino wrote, "Another stork has fallen, but the flock flies on." The stork symbol of Alsace soon adorned every fuselage, painted with careful pride. It became their guardian spirit, a promise that France would rise again. Back in England, 340 Squadron joined No. 610 RAF for nighttime interception. German bombers raided coastal cities. The French flew blind through searchlight cones and flak bursts, guided only by the crackling voice of controllers. René Mouchat's friend, Jacques-Henri Schloissing, recalled, "You feel alone in the dark. Only the instruments speak. Then suddenly light, tracers, and death in front of you." The nights were endless, the fear constant, but victory measurable. Every downed bomber was a small vengeance for occupied France. By early 1943, the Free French Air Forces numbered 3,000 personnel, but fewer than 400 combat-ready pilots. Every month, attrition thinned their ranks. Replacement crews came from French Africa, young men who had never seen Europe. The RAF rotated them through bases in Scotland and Egypt, teaching them to fly Spitfires, Hurricanes, and eventually American P-47 Thunderbolts. Each new aircraft felt like learning to breathe again. Out of hardship grew friendship. British ground crews learned to pronounce French names. French pilots learned to trust British mechanics with their lives. At Christmas 1942, the mess hall at Biggin Hill hung both flags side by side. They sang La Marseillaise and God Save the King together awkwardly, but sincerely. Someone shouted, "Next year in Paris." Everyone cheered, half believing it might come true. Censors cut names, but not feelings. One pilot wrote to his mother in Marseille, "When I fly, I see the coastline of France below. It is close enough to touch, but far enough to die for." Another to his fiancée, "If I do not return, know that I have already touched heaven." The letters were never sentimental in their own minds, only practical. Death was a routine hazard, like bad weather. By mid-1943, the tide of war was turning. The Allies were pushing across North Africa toward Italy. The Free French squadrons would soon trade the defense of Britain for the liberation of Europe. They had matured better aircraft, seasoned commanders, confidence earned through loss, and somewhere above the clouds, the ghosts of their fallen comrades seemed to guide them forward. When the order came to deploy south, one mechanic painted a message on the side of a Spitfire. "France calls, we answer." They had become something larger than nationality, a fraternity of the sky. Moroccans, Parisians, Bretons, Algerians, and Scots shared the same airspace, the same danger, the same purpose. General de Gaulle visited their base before departure. He saluted the assembled pilots and said, "Gentlemen, you are the wings of France. When you return, our land will follow." Those words lingered long after he left. For many, it would be the last speech they ever heard from him. The Free French squadrons were now veterans, their ranks blooded and unbreakable. They had proved themselves in Britain's gray skies and the deserts of Africa. Ahead lay new campaigns, Sicily, Corsica, and the liberation of their homeland. The forgotten eagles were ready to bring France home. When the desert wind blew, it sounded like an engine in the distance, the endless whisper of war that never slept. By early 1943, the French pilots of Groupe de Chasse 2-7 Alsace were fully integrated into the Allied push across North Africa. Rommel's Africa Corps was retreating. The Axis supply lines fractured, and the vast expanse of the Sahara had become the stage for one of France's greatest comebacks. For the men of Alsace, Africa was more than a battlefield, it was home. Many of them had grown up in Casablanca, Oran, or Algiers. The smell of sand and diesel was their childhood. Now they returned, not as colonials, but as liberators of their own soil. The Free French Command under General Henri Giraud and later Charles de Gaulle had unified the North African territories after Operation Torch, the Allied landings in November 1942. For the first time since 1940, France had a foothold in the war, a base of men, machines, and pride. At airfields carved out of rocky plains, Maison Blanche near Algiers, Tafara Aoui near Oran, and Bertaux in Tunisia, the Free French Air Forces reassembled like phoenixes from dust. The GC-2-7 Alsace Squadron arrived in battered P-40 Warhawks, still carrying desert scars from Syria. Their mechanics worked barefoot in the heat, bolting together aircraft with salvaged British parts and American engines. Their uniforms were mismatched: RAF flight suits, French insignia, Arab keffiyehs for sand protection. But when they took off, they were unmistakably French. The Cross of Lorraine, painted on every fuselage, their battle cry simple and defiant. Pour la France. The Axis still held Tunisia, the last corner of North Africa, under German control. Rommel's once proud army was trapped between Montgomery's 8th Army from the east and the newly landed American and French forces from the west. The Luftwaffe was desperate. They struck from hidden airstrips, bombing Allied convoys and harassing ground troops trying to cross the mountain passes of the Atlas. The job of Alsace was clear: clear the skies. In early 1943, they began daily sorties over the desert front. Each mission was short but deadly: 20 minutes of fuel, 15 minutes of combat, and no room for mistakes. The heat warped visibility. The sun blinded gunners. Even the sand became an enemy, clogging engines and burning eyes. But the men adapted. They learned to fly low, hugging the terrain, appearing like ghosts over the dunes. Their attacks were sudden, violent, and precise, ambushing German convoys and supply depots before vanishing back into the glare. On the 17th of March, 1943, a formation of 6 P-42s from Alsace spotted German Stukas attacking Allied positions near Gaulle. Without hesitation, they dove from 8,000 feet, engines screaming. Lieutenant Henri Durand later wrote, "The sand below rose up like smoke. We saw the Stukas diving black crosses on white wings. We came in from the sun. One burst, and the first went down, then another. They never saw us." In less than 10 minutes, the French downed 4 enemy aircraft without a single loss. It was their most decisive engagement yet, a turning point that proved the Free French could stand equal with any Allied squadron. That evening, at the mess tent, they toasted with tea laced with rum, shouting in half Arabic, half French, "To the ghosts of 1940 we are avenged." The Americans were watching. The U.S. Army Air Forces had arrived in North Africa in massive numbers after Operation Torch. To them, the French were strange, proud, emotional, unpredictable. But they couldn't deny the results. General Carl Spaatz, commander of the U.S. 12th Air Force, described them in a memo. "The French squadrons fight with style and savagery. They seem to turn revenge into fuel." French pilots began flying joint missions with American P-38 Lightnings and British Spitfires. Their coordination improved, tactics evolved, and soon the Free French Air Forces were operating as a unified, professional arm of the Allied command. Alsace was now part of the fighter group Bretagne, under the larger FAFL forces, Aériens Français Libres. Each new mission brought them closer to their ultimate goal: Europe. Every pilot in Alsace carried a story. Some were noblemen, others farmers, others sons of Moroccan dockworkers who had never seen France before the war. But once they strapped into a cockpit, hierarchy vanished. Captain Marcel Lefebvre, one of the unit's finest aces, was known for his quiet intensity. He spoke little, but flew with deadly precision. 4 confirmed kills, countless ground targets destroyed. He would later die in 1944 flying with the Normandy-Niemen Regiment in Russia. But his legend began here. Then there was Jean de Mauzet, nicknamed Morlaix, who defected from Vichy France to join the RAF. He became a symbol of Free French resilience, commanding mixed squadrons where colonial and European pilots fought side by side. And finally, Commandant Delfino, the father figure of the unit, a man whose calm voice over the radio steadied younger pilots. They said you could recognize him in flight, not by sight, but by tone. "Don't worry," he'd say during combat. "I'm on your wing." The North African campaign was more than military. It was psychological redemption. Each sortie erased a little of 1940's humiliation. In May 1943, after the fall of Tunis, Allied High Command held a brief ceremony on the tarmac of El Aouina airfield. The Cross of Lorraine flag was raised beside the Union Jack and the Stars and Stripes. General Juin himself, a veteran of the French Army of Africa, addressed the assembled pilots. France has not died. She has changed uniforms, and she has learned to fly. It was more than rhetoric. The Free French Air Force now had over 500 operational aircraft, Spitfires, P-42s, B-26 Marauders, and Lockheed Lightnings. Their pilots had logged nearly 30,000 combat hours. For the first time, the world began to understand that France was returning not as a defeated nation, but as a reborn one. The battle for Tunisia culminated in a massive air campaign over the Gulf of Hammamet. On the 22nd of April 1943, Alsace led a combined strike with British and American units to destroy German supply depots near Enfidaville. The operation lasted less than an hour, but it symbolized everything they had fought for. When they returned, their planes were blackened by smoke and sand. They had lost one pilot, Lieutenant Claude Cuny, shot down after covering his wingman's retreat. They buried him at dusk in the dunes behind the airfield, using a propeller blade as a cross. Mechanic Abdelkader Ben Ammar, who had served since Syria, said quietly, "The sand will remember." After the victory in North Africa, Alsace moved to Corsica in late 1943. From there, they would join the Italian campaign, a new phase of the war, one that would test their endurance even more. But as they left Africa behind, the men looked down from their cockpits at the deserts they had conquered. Beneath them stretched the land where their brothers lay nameless graves under shifting dunes. For them, the war was not about medals or headlines. It was about reclaiming dignity, theirs and their nations. By the end of 1943, Groupe de Chasse II, 7 Alsace, had flown more than 5,000 sorties and destroyed or damaged hundreds of enemy aircraft and vehicles. Their casualties were heavy, but their spirit unbroken. The RAF recognized their valor with citations of honor, and Allied newspapers began calling them the Storks of Freedom. But the pilots didn't care for fame. They cared about one horizon, the one they would cross when France was, finally, free. Captain Lefebvre wrote in his diary that December, "Each time I climb through the clouds, I imagine Paris below me. I imagine the lights returning." The war would take them next to Italy, to the rocky ridges of Monte Cassino, where their comrades on the ground would fight through hell itself. Above those same mountains, the forgotten eagles of Alsace would once again take flight, and ensure that France, though broken, never bowed. When the pilots of GC-2, 7 Alsace, took off from Corsica in January 1944, they knew the war had changed. The desert's vast emptiness was behind them. Ahead rose the jagged mountains of Italy, sharp, cold, and merciless. Below those peaks, men were dying to take a single hill. Above them, the sky itself was on fire. Italy was a graveyard of armies. After Mussolini's fall in 1943, German forces had turned the peninsula into a fortress, retreating north behind the Gustav Line, a chain of mountains fortified with bunkers, artillery, and machine gun nests. At the center of that line stood Monte Cassino, crowned by a 1,000-year-old Benedictine monastery. To the Allies, it was both a symbol and an obstacle. To the Germans, it was an impregnable shield. The Allied armies below fought uphill through rain, mud, and rubble. Above them, the Luftwaffe attacked relentlessly, and it was the task of Alsace to challenge them. Corsica's airfields were primitive, mud mixed with ice. Mechanics slept in tents wrapped in canvas and spare parachutes. Engines froze overnight, fuel lines cracked at dawn. Before every mission, pilots warmed their hands over tin cans filled with burning rags. One wrote in his logbook, "We fight two enemies, the Germans and the cold." Their Spitfires, marked the 8 and 9 models, had the speed to match German Messerschmitt Bif 109 seconds, and Focke-Wulf 190 seconds. but conditions made every takeoff a gamble. Still, every morning, they climbed into the sky. Their missions ranged from bomber escort to close air support. American B-25 Mitchells and British Wellingtons rumbled toward Cassino, loaded with high explosives. The French flew above them, fending off German interceptors and watching the smoke rise from the mountains. Captain Pierre Lorient, a young ace from Lorraine, recalled, "When the monastery crumbled under bombs, we could feel the tremor even at altitude. It was beautiful and terrible. Below us, history was being rewritten in dust." The monastery's destruction in February 1944 was one of the war's most controversial moments. A sacred building turned to rubble because it had become a fortress. The pilots saw both the tragedy and the necessity. For them, Monte Cassino wasn't just a target, it was the key to Europe's heart. Flying in Italy was unlike the desert or the Channel. The weather changed by the hour: snow at dawn, rain by noon, fog at dusk. Mountains swallowed plains whole. Radio signals died in valleys. One formation disappeared completely in a snowstorm over the Apennines, never to be found. When the weather cleared, mechanics found wreckage scattered across the slopes and a single boot wedged in ice. War in the air was merciless, but no less personal. Each pilot kept a tally of friends lost. By March, Alsace had buried 6 more. Yet their resolve hardened. They had become veterans, calm, precise, and quietly furious. In March 1944, General Charles de Gaulle visited the Italian front. He arrived in his trademark greatcoat, flanked by Free French troops, who saluted with the pride of reclaimed identity. At the airfield in Naples, he addressed the Alsace Squadron directly. "You have fought from Syria to the Sahara, from the desert to these mountains. France will return to her skies on your wings." Afterward, he shook each pilot's hand. They remembered his grip, strong, cold, and unyielding. One pilot whispered, "He carries France in his fist." When the Allies launched the Anzio landings in January 1944, the Luftwaffe struck back with ferocity. Alsace was tasked with nightly patrols over the beachhead, intercepting German bombers trying to push the Allies into the sea. The sea below glowed with tracer fire. Ships burned like candles. From 10,000 feet, the pilots could see the coastline as a ribbon of explosions. Flying at night was madness. No radar, little moonlight, and flak, bursting in silent blossoms of orange. Yet they flew anyway, guided only by instinct and faith. Lieutenant Maurice Chally, later to become a general, recalled, "You don't see the enemy. You feel him in the shiver of the clouds, in the flicker of a gun flash below. Then suddenly, you are face to face at 300 miles per hour." They called those missions blind dances. Few survived long enough to forget them. In May 1944, Alsace lost its commanding officer, Commandant Delfino. His Spitfire was hit during a strafing run near Monte Cassino. He radioed calmly, "I'm on fire, but I'll try to make the sea." He didn't. His plane vanished into the valley below, trailing smoke. For a week, his men flew with black ribbons tied around their flight scarves. The squadron's morale sank, but their fury rose. Every mission became personal. They began painting his initials, G.D., under their cockpits. When they shot down an enemy, they marked the victory for the commandant. After 4 brutal assaults, the Gustav Line finally cracked in May 1944. The Allies surged north toward Rome. Alsace flew ahead, bombing retreating columns and strafing trains along the Liri Valley. For many French pilots, it was the first time they had flown over a liberated European capital. When news reached them that Rome had fallen on June 4, 2 days before D-Day, the camp erupted in celebration. Mechanics fired pistols into the air, pilots danced on wings, someone brought out an accordion and played La Marseillaise. They were still far from home, but for the first time in years, the war felt winnable. 2 days later, on the 6th of June 1944, the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy. The Free French Air Forces were immediately ordered to prepare for redeployment. Their next mission was clear: Return to France. From Corsica, Alsace relocated to the south of France for Operation Dragoon, the second D-Day, the invasion of Provence in August 1944. The pilots knew what it meant. They weren't just fighting for victory now, they were fighting for home. On the 15th of August 1944, as dawn broke over the Mediterranean, the engines of Alsace roared to life. Their Spitfires, now bearing the Cross of Lorraine on blue-white-red tails, lifted off in formation. Below them, the invasion fleet glittered thousands of ships, endless waves of landing craft, heading toward the beaches near Saint-Tropez and Toulon. They climbed through the clouds, then banked west. For the first time since 1940, free French pilots flew combat missions over their own soil. When they crossed the coast, a voice crackled over the radio, half laughing, half weeping. "Monsieur, la France!" They attacked German convoys retreating from the Riviera, strafed supply depots, and intercepted Luftwaffe fighters fleeing north. Each sortie was both vengeance and redemption. As the French army advanced on the ground, the Free French Air Forces owned the skies. From Provence to the Rhône Valley, Alsace flew daily, sometimes 4 missions a day. Farmers in liberated villages waved from the fields as the Cross of Lorraine streaked overhead. To them, it wasn't just an aircraft, it was a miracle. A woman in Aix-en-Provence later told reporters, "When I saw the tricolor on that plane, I knew we were free again." By September 1944, Alsace was stationed in Lyon. For the first time, their families could send letters without censors. For some, there was no one left to write to, but still, they waited at the mail table each morning. One day, a parcel arrived at the base. A small package wrapped in wax paper, addressed simply to Les Îles-de-France. Inside was a tricolor ribbon and a note from a mother who heard her son's engine above our village. The pilots hung it in the mess tent beside their squadron flag. As 1944 turned to winter, the Free French Air Forces had become a formidable power. Over 1,000 aircraft bore the Cross of Lorraine. They fought not just in France, but in Germany, the Netherlands, and beyond. For GC-7 Alsace, the journey from exile to triumph had come full circle. From the fall of Paris to the liberation of Europe, they had flown the distance between despair and freedom. They were no longer refugees. They were heroes. In the months ahead, they would help strike at the heart of Germany, but the soul of their war had already been won. Above Cassino, Rome, and France itself, they had proven what their commander once said was true. A nation can lose its land, its government, even its name, but as long as its pilots fly, it has not lost its sky. The war was nearing its end, but for the pilots of GC-7 Alsace, it was far from over. In the winter of 1944, the Allies had crossed into Germany. The sky, once the domain of the Luftwaffe, now belonged to the men who had refused to surrender in 1940. France was free, but the fight for justice continued. For the Free French Air Forces, this was not just another campaign. It was the reckoning. By late 1944, Alsace had been re-equipped with Supermarine Spitfire MiG-9s and newly acquired Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Their new mission: escort Allied bombers on deep penetration raids into German territory. The Spitfires, once symbols of survival, were now instruments of vengeance. Each bore the Cross of Lorraine bright red against gunmetal gray, a mark that German pilots had come to fear. Flying from newly liberated airfields near Dijon and Luxeuil, the squadron joined the offensive across the Rhine. Their targets were German rail yards, ammunition depots, and retreating columns trying to regroup near Stuttgart and Karlsruhe. From above, Germany looked like a dying fire. Smoke rising from cities, rivers frozen, roads lined with wrecks. To many pilots, it was the first time they had seen the country that had haunted their dreams for 4 years. One of them, Lieutenant André Martel, wrote in his journal, "We do not fly for revenge. We fly so that no one will ever make us crawl again." The Luftwaffe was no longer invincible, but it was still dangerous. The Germans had introduced the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. Its silver silhouette streaked across the sky faster than anything the Allies could field. For the French pilots used to piston engines, it felt like chasing ghosts. They could barely react before the jet was gone. A flash, a burst of cannon fire, and a trail of vapor. During one patrol near the Black Forest, a pair of Me 262 seconds ambushed the formation. Lieutenant Martel's wingman was hit instantly. His Spitfire exploded mid-air, scattering fragments like burning paper. Martel radioed, "I've got him," and dove after the attacker. The jet outran him, disappearing into cloud. Later, Martel wrote, "It was like fighting the future with the past." Despite the danger, the Free French squadrons pushed deeper into Germany. Their discipline sharpened, their coordination flawless. They were no longer exiles. Fighting for a cause, they were an army returning history's debt. By early 1945, they were flying under the 1st French Air Corps, part of General de Lattre de Tassigny's army, advancing toward the Rhine. The missions were relentless, sometimes 3 in a single day. Pilots flew on minimal sleep, their eyes bloodshot, hands raw from cold, yet morale was unbreakable. They had seen the liberation of France, the cheers of their people, the flags unfurled in Paris. Now, they wanted one thing: to finish it. In February 1945, the Allies launched Operation Nordwind, the last German counteroffensive on the Western Front. French ground troops faced intense resistance near Strasbourg, and the Luftwaffe bombed French columns in reprisal. Alsace was ordered to provide immediate air cover. The operation became one of their fiercest. For days, the skies above the Vosges Mountains roared with duels. Spitfires weaved through tracer fire. Anti-aircraft guns flashed from the ridges. During one engagement, Captain Pierre Lorient downed 2 WWII seconds in a single pass, an extraordinary feat confirmed by both radar and ground observers. When he landed, the mechanics found 27 bullet holes in his wings. He just smiled and said, "I believe they were trying to write their surrender on my plane." By March 1945, the German front was collapsing. Alsace was tasked with destroying bridges and convoys retreating toward Bavaria. They flew low, sometimes at treetop level, dodging flak bursts that shredded the air. The forests burned beneath them, columns of smoke twisting upward like black ghosts. Lieutenant Georges Henry, a young pilot from Marseille, was hit by ground fire during one of these runs. His plane caught fire at 300 feet. He managed to bail out, his parachute half burned, and landed in a frozen river. Local villagers found him hours later, half conscious, clinging to a branch. When asked what he had been doing, he whispered, "Finishing what began in 1940. In April 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing. The Allies crossed the Rhine in force, and German defenses crumbled. Alsace escorted French and American bombers on the last missions against Munich and Augsburg. They strafed convoys, rail lines, and airfields where the Luftwaffe had abandoned aircraft in panic. One pilot described, "The scene. Everywhere smoke. Everywhere silence. We were flying over a dead empire." It was then that radio transmissions from German pilots grew desperate, broken English, calls for mercy, confusion. For men who had once heard only arrogance from the enemy, it was a haunting reversal. When Germany finally surrendered on the 8th of May 1945, the French pilots received the news mid-air. The order was short: cease operations, return to base. They circled once, silently. Then, one of them broke formation and began to sing over the radio, La Marseillaise, crackling through static and tears. At their base near Dijon, the men of Alsace lined up beside their Spitfires. They had survived exile, defeat, desert heat, mountain storms, and the fire of combat. Now, for the first time in years, there was peace. Out of 250 men who had served with Alsace since 1941, More than 90 had been killed or were missing. Their names were painted on the hangar wall in chalk. No one spoke as they read them. Then General de Lattre arrived with an aide, carrying a tricolor flag. He handed it to the commanding officer and said simply, "France thanks you. You kept her honor alive when everything else was lost." The flag fluttered above the runway, backlit by a gray spring sky. Many of the surviving pilots could not return to normal life. Some joined the new French Air Force, helping to rebuild what had been destroyed. Others became test pilots, chasing speed instead of survival. A few never flew again, haunted by memories of the men they left behind. Captain Pierre Lorient went on to command France's first jet squadron. Maurice Chal became Chief of Staff of the French Air Force, and decades later, a controversial political figure during the Algerian War. History, it seemed, would not let them rest. But wherever they went, they carried the same emblem: the Cross of Lorraine, not as a badge, but as a scar. GC-2-7 Alsace continued to fly long after the guns fell silent. In 1946, they were stationed in Germany as part of the occupation forces, the same land they had once bombed. Civilians watched in awe as French Spitfires roared over their towns, this time not as enemies, but as reminders of consequence. The squadron later transitioned to jet aircraft. Vampires, Mystères, and eventually Mirages. But the spirit remained. Their motto still read, "Toujours en avant," always forward. René Mouchot, Pierre Lorient, Georges Delfino, Marcel Lefebvre. These names became legends whispered in flight schools across France. Every young pilot learned their stories. Every cockpit carried a trace of their defiance. In 1953, the Air Force dedicated a monument at Le Chaux-les-Bains to the Free French airmen who fought under the RAF. Carved into stone were the words Mouchot once wrote, "To die in the sky for one's country is to live forever among the clouds." And so they did. The Free French Air Forces had started as a handful of exiles with borrowed planes. By 1945, they were a respected force of thousands of men who had rewritten the legacy of defeat into one of resilience. They proved that a nation could rise again, not from conquest, but from courage. Their flight paths traced more than missions. They traced the rebirth of France itself. When their engines finally fell silent, the echoes remained in every contrail over Europe, every monument of freedom, every French flag flying under open skies. While France fell, her pilots rose again in British skies, in African deserts, over Italian mountains, and finally, above a liberated homeland. They were the forgotten eagles, and long after the war ended, their wings never stopped casting shadows over history. The war was over. The guns had fallen silent, but the sound of engines still echoed in memory. For the men who had fought from Britain to North Africa, from Italy to Germany, peace felt unfamiliar, too quiet, too slow, too fragile. The Free French airmen had lived 4 years at full throttle. Their lives measured in flight hours, their friendships in missions survived. Now they were told to rest. But how does one rest when the sky still calls your name? In May 1945, as Paris celebrated liberation, many of its heroes walked unnoticed through the crowds. The returning airmen wore uniforms faded from sun and smoke. They had no parades waiting, no medals pinned upon arrival, only silence, exhaustion, and the strange emptiness of survival. For every pilot who returned, another had not. The Free French Air Forces lost nearly half their flying personnel during the war. In Alsace alone, over 90 names were carved into memorial plaques, men who had taken off and never come home. One veteran, Jacques Andriot, described victory in a single sentence: "We were proud, but the sky was emptier." France in 1945 was not the same country they had left. The cities were scarred, the fields mined, the people changed. Those who had stayed under occupation viewed the Free French with both admiration and guilt. Those who had fought abroad returned as strangers in their own land. When the pilots of GC-2-7 Alsace landed at Le Bourget airfield outside Paris, It was raining. Crowds gathered, waving flags and shouting, "Vive la France!" But the men hardly smiled. One mechanic whispered, "We've come home to a graveyard wearing a tricolor." That night, they dined together in silence. A single candle burning in the center of the mess table for the ones who didn't return. Out of the ashes, a new air force was born. In 1946, the Armée de l'Air was officially reconstituted, this time unified, modernized, and free of Vichy influence. The lessons of exile and defeat had reshaped it completely. Many of the Free French veterans took command positions. They trained a new generation of pilots who had never known occupation, men who would soon fly jets faster than sound, but who would always salute the memory of those who flew Spitfires in borrowed uniforms. The symbol of the Cross of Lorraine was kept on their badges, a quiet reminder that independence had once depended on courage. In the late 1942s, Alsace transitioned to de Havilland Vampire jets, sleek, silver, and almost alien compared to the piston-driven warbirds they had known. For the veterans, the first flight in a jet felt like stepping into the future they had once fought to protect. Captain Pierre Lorillon was among the first to test the new aircraft. After landing, he joked, "She climbs like freedom, but bites like regret." With jet power came a new challenge: how to build an air force worthy of peace. The men who had lived through exile now found themselves teaching students born after the war, kids who saluted them with awe but couldn't imagine a world without liberty. In 1953, at Le Joy-les-Bains Air Base, a granite monument was unveiled for the fallen pilots of the Forces Aériennes Françaises Libres. The wind that day carried the faint hum of engines from a formation of modern jets flying overhead. On the monument were engraved the names of every squadron: Île-de-France, Lorraine, Alsace, and Normandy-Niemen. At the top, carved deep into stone, were the words, "Ils ont donné leurs ailes pour que la France renaisse." They gave their wings so that France might be reborn. Veterans stood shoulder to shoulder, their hair silvered by time. Some wore medals, others wore none. All of them looked upward as the jets passed the sound of a new generation carrying their legacy into the clouds. But history, like war, is not always fair. For decades, the Free French pilots remained overshadowed by larger narratives: D-Day, resistance fighters, and the liberation of Paris. Their battles took place in distant skies, their victories invisible to those on the ground. Even in French schools, the names of Ten, Mouchot, Lefebvre, and Lorillon were rarely spoken. Some veterans felt forgotten, others quietly proud that their deeds needed no witness. René Mouchot's mother once said in an interview, "My son flew so that others could walk free. That is enough." Yet, in recent years, France began to remember. Documentaries, memorials, and air shows revived their stories. Their diaries were republished, their voices restored. Every year, on June 18th, the anniversary of de Gaulle's call from London, the French Air Force lays a wreath beneath Mouchot's portrait. The inscription reads, "He died believing in France, and France believed in him." The men of Alsace lived long enough to see the Cold War begin a new age of tension, missiles, and supersonic speed. They watched as the Mirage jet replaced the Spitfire, as radar replaced intuition, as the romance of flight gave way to precision and machines. Yet when interviewed, most said they missed not the planes, but the purpose. Lieutenant Maurice Chal, long after becoming a general, summarized it simply: "We fought for an idea. Machines come and go, but ideas don't rust." Today, every cadet who earns his wings at Salon de Provence learns about the Free French squadrons. In the classrooms, photographs of Alsace pilots hang beside modern jet commanders, a lineage unbroken by time. At ceremonies, their motto is still whispered before takeoff: "Toujours en avant," always forward. And when a young pilot steps into the cockpit for his first solo flight, he carries on his shoulder patch the same Cross of Lorraine that once flew over the English Channel, the Sahara, and the Rhine. The symbol remains, not as nostalgia, but as duty to remember that freedom was once fragile enough to depend on a handful of exiles in borrowed planes. In 2003, the last surviving pilot of Alsace, Pierre Lorient, passed away at the age of 88. He had flown 250 missions in 5 different campaigns. At his funeral, the French Air Force sent a mirage formation over the cemetery in salute. As the jets roared overhead, one broke formation and climbed toward the sun, the missing man tribute. His granddaughter later said, "When the engines faded, it felt as if the war had finally ended." Lorient had once written a final letter to his comrades, found among his papers after his death. "If we are remembered, let it not be for victory, but for refusal. Refusal to kneel when the world expected us to." Time erases battlefields, but not skies. Above Europe, the same routes still exist in visible trails, once flown by men who refused to let France fall into silence. Commercial jets now trace their old paths from London to Marseille, from Algiers to Paris. Passengers look out of their windows, seeing only clouds. But somewhere between those clouds lie the ghosts of the forgotten eagles. They do not haunt, they guard. Their contrails are memory itself, fleeting, bright, and eternal. Epilogue. On the 80th anniversary of D-Day, the French Air Force flew a single Spitfire, restored in the markings of GC-2-7 Alsace. It soared above the beaches of Normandy, its engine echoing across the same winds that once carried the voices of exiled men calling, "Bonjour, la France, nous revenons." The crowd below looked up. For a moment, history was alive again. Because when France fell, her pilots rose, and through them she never truly came down.